In a quiet Tennessee town, a young female mechanic named Tessa Harlow restored a veteran's forgotten 1988 pickup truck, not for money, not for fame, but to honor a silent wish. The veteran, Henry Callahan, had one dream left: to hear his old truck rumble to life one last time. What followed was more than a repair. It became a journey of memory, healing, and heart. This emotional story of a 1988 pickup truck brought back to life will remind you that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness restore far more than just an engine. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. The morning began like most do in Crest Hill, a forgotten town in Tennessee, where trains still blow their horns, but no longer stop. The tracks are rusted now, like old veins once full of life, and tucked right beside that abandoned train station, under a tin roof patched with hope and duct tape, was Tessa Harlow's garage. At 24, Tessa wasn't what folks expected from a mechanic. Slender, quiet, with grease under her nails and music from the 70s, humming from a dusty radio. She worked on machines like they were living things. Her father had once fixed locomotives here before cancer took him, and the trains took their final leave. That morning, Tessa locked up early, wiping her hands on a rag that once belonged to her dad. She was headed to the farmer's market, hoping for some warm apple pie and fresh coffee. But fate had parked something else in her path. As she passed the weathered homes near the edge of town, she spotted him, a man sitting silently on a front porch, staring at a broken-down 1988 pickup truck like it still had something left to say. She didn't know it then, but that truck and that man were about to change everything. Tessa hadn't meant to stop, but something about the way the old man sat still as stone, eyes fixed on that lifeless 1988 pickup truck, pulled at her. The porch creaked under her boots as she approached. "Morning," she said gently, hands in her pockets. The man looked up. His face was worn like river rock, carved by time and sorrow. "You fix cars?" he asked. Voice raspy, like it hadn't spoken much in years. "I do," Tessa nodded. "That one yours?" He gave a soft chuckle, more breath than sound. Bought it brand new after I got back from the desert. 1988. Dodge Ram. My first purchase as a free man. She looked at it more closely. The paint had long since surrendered to rust. One of the tires had caved in. The windshield was cracked, and the engine hood was half open, as if the truck itself had given up. "I'm Henry," he said, slowly rising. "Henry Callahan, 68 years old and counting." "Tessa Harlow," she replied, shaking his hand. 24. I run the garage down by the tracks." He gave her a small nod. "Figured you were too young to know what a carburetor is." She smiled. "Try me." They sat on the porch. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it came out like pages from an old book full of grit, heartache, and hidden softness. He told her about the pickup, how it was more than a vehicle. It was the first thing he ever bought for himself after serving 2 tours overseas. It took him across the country, through jobs and heartbreaks, fatherhood and funerals. "It hauled lumber when I built our first home," he said. "Towed my little girl's first bicycle. Took me and my wife to the lake every July 4th for 30 years. And now it just sits there, like me." His eyes glistened, and Tessa felt something stir deep in her gut. She didn't know this man, but she knew the look in his eyes: longing, regret, and a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still time for something to be made right. He paused. "I'm not asking for much. I'd like to hear it run again. One last time. Feel the wheel in my hands. That sound, that rumble, It used to drown out the worst of things. Tessa sat still for a while. Then, with a slow breath, she nodded. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll bring it back." Henry looked at her, unsure whether to believe it. "You serious?" "I am," she said. "But I won't lie, it won't be easy." He chuckled, this time with a bit more life. "Nothing worth doing ever is?" That evening, Tessa returned with her old Chevy flatbed and 2 friends, Ryan, a diesel tech who owed her a favor, and Zoe, a welder with hands steadier than any man Tessa had ever met. The 3 of them worked into the night, lifting the truck from the weeds and loading it onto the flatbed like an artifact being unearthed from history. The next morning, Henry showed up at her garage with a worn baseball cap and a thermos of black coffee. "I figured I'd lend a hand," he said. "You can supervise." Tessa grinned. "And tell us stories." And that's how it began. They stripped the truck bare. Bolts snapped off like dry twigs. The engine was a mess of rust, gunk, and old memories. But underneath it all, there was still structure, still soul. Tessa knew that feeling. She had rebuilt her own heart once from the ruins her father's death left behind. Maybe that's why this job mattered more than any other. 3 days in, they found something unexpected. Zoe had been vacuuming under the driver's seat when she called out, "Tessa, you need to see this." Inside a small wooden box tucked deep beneath the seat, they discovered a bundle of time-handwritten letters with yellowed edges, black and white photographs of young men in uniform, and 1 tarnished silver medal with the inscription, "For Valor, 1989. Henry stood in stunned silence when they handed it to him. His fingers trembled as he opened the first letter. Tears welled in his eyes. "I thought these were lost." "Burned in the fire," he whispered. For a moment, the garage was still nothing but the ticking of the wall clock and the humming of the old radio. Tessa felt the weight of it. Then this wasn't just about restoring a truck. This was about restoring a part of someone that had been left behind. Over the following days, the work intensified. Tessa spent her nights browsing vintage forums, scouring junkyards, trading parts online. She even drove 230 miles to get an original 1988 carburetor from a collector in Georgia. There were setbacks, parts that didn't fit, deliveries delayed, a cracked fuel line that forced them to start over. But every time she thought of giving up, she remembered the way Henry had looked at that box of letters, like a man given back a piece of his soul. On the 7th day, with grease in her hair and blisters on her palms, Tessa stepped back and looked at the engine. It wasn't finished yet, but it was breathing again. Just like Henry. The rain came sudden that week, thick southern rain that soaks you to the bone within minutes. The kind that turned the road beside the tracks into a muddy river and made Tessa's garage smell of damp concrete and wet denim. But even the weather couldn't stop the work. They were close now, closer than any of them had expected. The engine purred again. Not perfectly, but enough to shake the walls with a familiar rumble. Tessa caught Henry wiping a tear the first time it fired up. He blamed it on the smoke. "You sure this ain't gonna fall apart on me the moment I take a corner?" he asked with a crooked smile. "I give you a 60% chance of surviving." She smirked back. "Maybe 70 if you don't drive like a teenager." They laughed, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside the garage didn't exist. That night, Tessa stayed behind long after the others left. There was still so much to do, fine-tuning the brakes, redoing the upholstery, checking the wiring, but her body was too exhausted to move. She sat on the floor beside the truck, listening to the rain drum against the tin roof. As her eyes wandered across the bed of the truck, now mostly cleared of rust and repainted in a deep navy blue, something caught her eye. a sliver of wood poking out beneath the side panel. Curious. She stood and reached for it, wiggling it free with both hands. It was a small, flat wooden crate sealed shut with nails so old they crumbled under her screwdriver. Inside, wrapped in a faded army blanket, was something she hadn't expected: another collection of letters. But these weren't from fellow soldiers. These were written to Margaret, Henry's wife. The handwriting was the same, bold, slanted, but the words were softer, more vulnerable. These letters weren't from war zones. They were from motel rooms, construction sites, long drives home. Tessa hesitated. She knew this was private, sacred, but something urged her to read just one. Margaret, the road's longer than it should be tonight. Thought I'd be home by now. But the job ran late. I miss your voice. I miss the way you touch my hand when you think I'm not paying attention. I'll be home soon. Tell our girl I picked up licorice from that gas station she likes, the red kind. Love you always, Henry. Tessa closed the letter slowly, heart aching in her chest. She looked over at the photos inside the box, one of Henry and Margaret sitting on the tailgate with a little girl between them. All three of them smiling, untouched by time. The next morning, Tessa didn't say anything about the letters, not at first, but something in her had shifted. This wasn't just a mechanical restoration anymore. It was spiritual, emotional. And she wasn't going to let this man leave the world without knowing he and his memories mattered. She made a decision. While Henry supervised the rebuild and Zoe worked the welding torch, Tessa contacted the local veterans organization. She gave them the names she'd seen in the old photographs, names scrawled in the backs with little messages like July 89, Riyadh, last patrol. A week passed with no word. Then, on a Sunday morning, just as they were finishing the final chrome detail on the front grille, she got a call. The voice on the line was gravelly, older. You're looking for Frank Anders. Yes, Tessa said, heart leaping. This is him. Who's asking? 2 days later, Frank Anders pulled into Crest Hill in a rusty minivan with a cane and a duffel bag full of stories. With him was Leo Martin, another name from the back of the photo, now blind in one eye, but still cracking jokes like it was 1989. Tessa didn't tell Henry in advance. She simply asked him to come by the garage around sunset. When he walked in and saw those two men waiting, leaning against the hood of the 1988 pickup truck like time had folded in on itself, he froze. Henry goddamn Callahan, Frank said, voice trembling. You still kicking? Henry's lip quivered. You're alive. No thanks to the chow hall, Leo grinned. Tears came freely. No one tried to stop them. They stayed up late that night in the garage drinking cheap beer, trading war stories, and sitting in the back of the truck like it was still the late 80s. Tessa watched from the corner, quiet and overwhelmed. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. The moment said it all. By the time the sky turned black and the air cooled, Tessa brought out something else. Something wrapped in the same army blanket the letters had been stored in. She handed it to Henry. He opened it slowly. The letters, the photos, the memories. But this time, they were carefully preserved, laminated, and bound in a leather folder engraved with the words, "The road we took." Henry looked at Tessa as if seeing her for the first time. Why'd you do all this? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, brushing back a tear. Because someone once told me, nothing worth doing is ever easy. After that night, something shifted. Henry Callahan had always been a man of few words. Life had taught him that silence was safer on the battlefield, in marriage, even in grief. Words didn't bring your friends back. They didn't stop a wife from dying too soon, or a daughter from moving so far away that even her Christmas cards felt foreign. But something about that garage, about Tessa. Broke through the walls he didn't even realize he'd built. He showed up early the next day. No thermos, no hat, just him holding a box of parts she didn't ask for, freshly cleaned and labeled. "You're getting sloppy with your inventory," he muttered with a wink. Tessa grinned, knowing full well she had everything sorted to a fault. But she let him have the win. They worked side by side in a rhythm that felt almost sacred. No music, no chatter, just tools clinking, rubber soles scuffing the concrete floor, and the occasional murmur of shared memory. It was the kind of silence that heals instead of hides. Later that afternoon, as the sun cast long golden shadows through the garage windows, Henry sat on an old milk crate and spoke for a long time longer than he ever had before. "Margaret died 5 years ago," he began. Stroke took her fast. 1 minute she was butter and toast, next minute, gone. Tessa didn't interrupt. "She always loved that truck. Said it made her feel safe. Like if we had that truck, we could survive anything. Fires, war, recession hell, even the apocalypse." He laughed dryly. Guess she wasn't wrong. He stared at the truck like it was glowing. "After she passed, I stopped driving it. Couldn't bring myself to. The damn thing smelled like her perfume for months. There was a scarf of hers in the glove box I couldn't even touch without breaking down." His voice cracked. "I used to think I'd take it to the junkyard one day. Just let it go quietly. The way she did. But every time I looked out that window and saw it sitting there in the grass, it felt like she was waiting on me. Like she was still holding the passenger door open." Tessa's throat tightened. "I never got to say goodbye," he said. "Not really." And then he looked at her, eyes glassy, but clear. "You gave me that. You gave me the chance to remember her without it hurting so damn much." Tessa didn't reply right away. Her hands were covered in grease, but she wiped them on her jeans anyway and sat down beside him. "You think I'm just fixing your truck?" she finally said. "But this has fixed something in me too." Henry tilted his head. "I lost my dad when I was 17. She continued. "He ran this garage, died of a heart attack one morning before work. We didn't even get to say goodbye. I stopped coming here for months. Thought I'd sell it, forget it all." She looked around the garage with soft eyes. "But I came back, because something in me knew. This place wasn't just bolts and oil. It was him. Every creaky drawer, every fingerprint on the door, every stupid old poster on the wall. It was him. Still here." She glanced at the 1988 pickup truck. "And that's what your truck is. It's not just a vehicle. It's a home, a witness to a life well lived." Later that evening, Zoe and Ryan came by to help finish the last few touches. Upholstery, paint buffing, tail lights. The truck had already begun to shimmer like something new, but not too new. They'd kept the spirit of it alive, a few dents, a scratch on the bumper, the worn leather steering wheel still bearing the fingerprint of time. As the others worked, Henry quietly opened the glove box. Inside, folded neatly, was Margaret's scarf. He didn't cry this time. Instead, he tucked it into his breast pocket and smiled. "Tessa," he called. "I think she'd be proud of this." Tessa looked up, breath catching. "I think your dad would be proud too." They didn't need a ceremony. No ribbon cutting, no big announcements. But they both knew something sacred had happened in that little garage, something neither of them would forget. Before he left that night, Henry stood by the truck, running his hand along the hood. He said, "I spent a long time thinking the best parts of my life were behind me." He paused. "But maybe some of the best parts are what we do for others, when we think we've got nothing left to give." Tessa nodded. "Maybe that's when it matters most." A week later, the truck was ready. Not ready in the showroom sense, but ready in the way an old soul finally finds peace. The paint gleamed in its original deep navy blue, lovingly restored by hand. Stroke by stroke. The engine purred with that low, comforting growl that made Henry close his eyes and smile every time he heard it. The interior still smelled faintly of old leather and motor oil, but Tessa had tucked a sprig of lavender under the dashboard, a small tribute to Margaret's favorite scent. The morning of the test drive, the town was unusually quiet. Even the trains, though long gone, seemed to hush their ghostly echoes. Henry stood beside the truck, hands trembling not from age, but from something deeper reverence, perhaps. Awe, the way someone looks at a memory made flesh. "You sure she'll hold?" he asked, patting the hood like an old friend. Tessa nodded. "She'll get you there." He climbed in slowly, like entering a sacred space. Tessa stood back, watching every move, every breath. The engine roared to life, and just like that he was driving again. He took it slow, easing down the main street, past the barbershop that hadn't changed in 30 years, past the church where Margaret once sang in the choir, past the diner that still served meatloaf like it was 1962. Neighbors came out onto porches. Some waved, some watched in quiet disbelief. A few clapped, a couple cried, and then he turned back toward the garage. When he stepped out, there was something different in his face, not just joy, not just nostalgia, something lighter, like a man who had finally let go of a weight he'd carried for too long. But what came next, neither he nor Tessa could have predicted. 3 days later, a stranger came by the garage, middle-aged, expensive boots, nervous smile. "You Tessa Harlow." "That's me," she said, wiping grease from her hands. He handed her a business card. James Carter, Veterans Legacy Foundation. "I heard about what you did for Henry Callahan," he said, eyes sincere. "Frank Anders told us, Leo too. We think there's something special in what you do." Tessa raised an eyebrow. "I just fix old trucks." "No," he said, "you restore memories." He explained that the foundation had been quietly searching for ways to honor aging veterans, many of whom had stories locked away in garages, in boxes, in rusted machines no one cared to understand. They'd tried documentaries, interviews, memorial walls, but what Tessa did, it was tangible. It was living. "What if we helped fund a program?" he asked. "You run the shop. We bring the vets, their vehicles, their stories. You help bring them back to life." Tessa stood stunned. She glanced at the garage, still full of dust, tools, and second-hand parts. "I'm just a girl with a socket wrench and a stubborn streak," she said, half joking. "And apparently," he replied, "a heart big enough to hold a generation's worth of untold history." She didn't give an answer right away. Instead, that night, she walked to Henry's house. The porch light was on. He was sitting in his usual spot, coffee mug in hand, truck parked proudly in the drive, like it had never been gone. She told him everything. He listened, quiet as always. But when she finished, he leaned forward and said, "Don't think of it as fixing trucks. Tessa, think of it as giving people their final lap. One more mile, one more moment to feel alive." Then he looked her in the eyes and added, "And I'll help. However I can. I may not be able to lift an engine, but I can lift a story." By the following week, things moved quickly. The Veterans Legacy Foundation sent the first check a modest grant to help Tessa expand the garage and buy proper equipment. Word spread online. Emails came in from across the country, children of veterans asking if she could help with their father's old Mustangs, motorcycles, even farm tractors. The garage, once a quiet space haunted by grief, became a place of reunion. Old friends returned. Mechanics offered their time. Local high school students came by to learn. It became something sacred. It became a place where memory had a motor. And through it all, Henry stayed close. He wasn't just a client anymore. He was family. Sometimes, he'd come by just to sit and tell stories to the younger volunteers. Other times, he'd roll up his sleeves and show a teenager how to strip down a carburetor, grumbling when they got it wrong and laughing when they didn't. But most often, he'd sit in that 1988 pickup truck, engine off, radio on low, fingers tracing the steering wheel, as if every turn brought him closer to the people he once loved. And every time Tessa looked at him, she knew. This garage wasn't built just to fix what was broken. It was built to remember what was beautiful. The garage didn't look like much from the outside, still the same chipped red paint and squeaky screen door. But inside, everything had changed. Tessa had always been good with her hands. Bolts, bearings, timing belts, those made sense. But now, every vehicle that rolled into her shop carried more than mechanical problems. They came with silence, pain, stories tucked deep beneath rusted frames. And she had learned how to listen. The first few weeks of the new project brought in a parade of forgotten machines, each with its own soul. A 1971 Harley from a Vietnam vet who'd gone 30 years without speaking of the war. A tractor from a woman who'd run her family's farm alone while her husband was deployed in Iraq. A dilapidated Jeep that once ferried a medic through sandstorms and roadside bombs. Tessa didn't just fix them. She studied them, asked questions, invited their owners to sit beside her. Sometimes they opened up, sometimes they didn't. But by the time the engine roared again, something inside them always softened. What surprised her most, though, was how much she was changing. For years. She'd lived inside a shell. The loss of her father had hardened her. She didn't date, didn't dream beyond the next oil change. The garage was a fortress she built around herself. But now that fortress had windows. She found herself laughing more, eating lunch with volunteers instead of alone in the corner, playing music out loud again, country ballads, soft jazz, even some classic rock when the job called for it. There were moments, small, precious ones, when she'd look around the garage and feel something swell in her chest. Not pride, not nostalgia, something simpler. Belonging! Henry, too, was blooming in ways no one expected. He became the unofficial greeter, always parked in his 1988 pickup out front, ready with a story or a joke. When veterans came in unsure, he'd be the one to sit beside them, slide a thermos of black coffee their way, and say, "She's the real deal. This one. Let her work her magic." He no longer shuffled when he walked. His eyes were brighter, his laugh louder. But more than that, he seemed to forgive himself. One afternoon, Tessa found him in the back corner of the garage, staring at an old photo of himself in uniform, taped above a toolbox. "You miss it?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. "I missed it for a long time," he finally said. "Then I spent years trying to forget it. But now I think I've learned to just carry it." Tessa nodded. "It's not about erasing the past. It's about choosing how you carry it." He smiled. "You sound like someone's therapist." "Probably yours," she grinned. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need to be filled. One evening, as summer crept into town and fireflies began flickering in the dusk, Tessa received a letter in the mail. No return address. Just a folded piece of paper with a typed note. "My father died before I ever got to know him. He never spoke about the war. But when I saw what you did for Henry Callahan, I felt like maybe someone out there still remembers them. Thank you. A grateful daughter." She read it 3 times, hands trembling slightly. Then she walked out to the truck bed behind the garage and tucked the letter into a tin box, one she'd started keeping with little mementos from the journey photos. Name tags, fuel receipts with stories scribbled on the back. She called it her living archive. and it was growing fast. As summer turned to fall, local schools began inviting Tessa to speak. High school kids came for internships, thinking they'd just learn about wrenches and oil changes. But they learned about people, about listening, about honoring the hands that built the world before them. And Tessa, she began dreaming again, of expanding, of building a second garage in another small town, of writing down the stories before they were lost to time, maybe even a book. But more than anything, she dreamed of staying true to the promise she made that rainy morning when she first saw Henry staring at that truck. I'll bring it back. But she hadn't just brought back a truck. She'd brought back a man's hope, her own voice, and a community's sense of memory. One day, while closing up the garage, she noticed a small wooden sign nailed just above the entrance. She hadn't seen it before. Carved into it, in shaky but deliberate handwriting, were the words, "Restoration doesn't start with the engine. It starts with the heart." Signed underneath in tiny letters, her C. She smiled, and for the first time in years, Tessa walked away from the garage humming a tune, the sound of engines fading behind her, replaced by something deeper, something warmer, something alive. The autumn leaves came late that year. They clung to their branches like they didn't want to let go flashes of amber and deep crimson against the sleepy sky. The air held that crisp, golden stillness that only comes when a season knows it's about to change. Tessa stood outside the garage, her hands tucked into her jacket, watching the sunrise over the ridge. The shop was quiet for once. No hammering, no grinding metal, just birds, wind, and the hum of something sacred in the silence. Inside, Henry was sitting in the 1988 pickup truck, hands resting gently on the wheel. He looked older than usual, but peaceful. "Tessa," he called softly. She walked in, smiling. "You ready?" He nodded. More than I thought I'd ever be. That day wasn't marked by fanfare. There were no news crews, no speeches, just a gathering of those who understood what was really happening. Frank and Leo were there, leaning on folding chairs near the garage door, each with a cup of lukewarm coffee. Zoe brought a handmade plaque and quietly nailed it to the garage wall, built with memory. Driven by heart. Some of the local kids came too, and a few of the veterans whose vehicles Tessa had helped restore. They stood in quiet reverence, hats in hand, as Henry started the engine one last time. The truck's rumble filled the space, not loud, not proud, but deep, solid, alive. Henry looked over at Tessa. "Want to ride with me?" She smiled. "I thought you'd never ask." They drove slowly through Crest Hill, past the hardware store, the diner, the old tracks. The sun caught the windshield just right, making the chrome gleam like polished silver. Tessa glanced over and saw Henry with one hand on the wheel, the other gently stroking the edge of Margaret's scarf, still folded in the cup holder. "I feel her here," he said quietly. "I feel them all." She nodded, holding back tears. "You're not driving alone today." They took the long route out past the lake where Henry and Margaret used to picnic, past the now empty field where their daughter once flew kites. And then, as they crested a hill overlooking the entire valley, Henry pulled over. "I think this is far enough," he said. They sat there in silence, the engine idling like a heartbeat. "I'm not scared anymore," he said suddenly. "Not of the end, not of being forgotten. You gave me more than a second chance. Tessa, you gave me my life back." She swallowed hard. "You gave me mine too." He turned to her, smiling gently. "Promise me something. Anything. When I'm gone, keep the truck running. Let it take someone else home." A few weeks later, on a rainy Tuesday morning, Henry passed away peacefully in his sleep. No pain, No fear, just silence and stillness and a life well remembered. The funeral was small, simple, just like him. Tessa parked the 1988 pickup out front, keys in the ignition, engine quietly running. A single photo sat on the dashboard. Henry, Margaret, and their daughter sitting on the tailgate, the son behind them, all three laughing like they had nowhere else to be. People came and went, laying flowers on the hood, touching the fender like it was something holy. And when the last person left, Tessa climbed into the driver's seat, placed her hand on the wheel, and whispered, "Thank you." Months passed. The garage was busier than ever. But every now and then, when the sun was just right and the day was quiet, Tessa would pull the truck out onto the road and just drive. No destination, no time limit. And always. She took the long way past the lake, the diner, the old tracks, as if retracing a life, mile by mile. Sometimes, she'd pick up a passenger, an old veteran with trembling hands, a widow holding on to a memory, a child who never knew their father but had heard he once drove a truck just like this. Each ride had a different story, but the feeling, always the same, like they were going home. One evening, as the stars blinked awake, Tessa stood beside the truck, hand on the roof, heart full. The garage lights glowed behind her, and inside hung a new sign. Legacy Garage, every engine has a story. She looked up at the sky, whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, and stepped back into the shop. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the empty road. But in the distance, the faint sound of an engine echoed through the valley, low, steady, eternal. And in that sound lived everything that had ever mattered: love, memory, redemption, and the quiet, beautiful truth that the road doesn't end. It simply begins again. Sometimes, we think we're just fixing something broken: an old truck, a leaky pipe, a cracked photograph frame. But the truth is, what we're really restoring is connection, memory, humanity. In a world obsessed with speed and progress, stories like Henry's remind us that what truly matters doesn't move fast. It waits, quietly, rusting in the backyard, hiding in glove compartments, living in silence, hoping to be found again. Tessa didn't just bring a pickup back to life. She gave a man permission to feel again, to forgive himself, to remember that he mattered. And in doing so, she rediscovered her own heart. One gear, one bolt, one quiet conversation at a time. The lesson is simple, but powerful. Sometimes the most important repairs happen inside the soul, not under the hood. And sometimes, giving someone a last ride becomes your first step toward healing. Let's never underestimate what kindness, patience, and a little bit of grease can do. The end. Up next, 2 more stories that will move you. Tap to keep the engine running, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some memories are worth reviving.